I was watching a friend of mine research a new laptop recently. He was just ruthless about it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, checking benchmarks, verifying specs, reading all these expert reviews from multiple sources. He was operating with just pure logic, running what I call 2024 software.
Right. All data-driven.
Completely. But then later that night, the conversation turned to a sensitive political topic, and his whole demeanor just snapped. It was like a switch flipped.
I think I know where this is going.
He ignored every single verifiable fact I mentioned, just kept repeating the story he'd heard from his social circle. The data didn't matter anymore. He just had to defend his tribe. It was this fascinating, almost jarring switch. It reminded me of a story about a peasant in the year 1624 being told not to go into the woods because of demons. And you think about it, back then, blind faith in a scary story was actually a brilliant survival tool.
Yeah, it kept you from getting eaten by wolves.
Exactly. It was the only way to stop you from getting eaten in a world where you couldn't just Google the truth. But looking at my friend, I realized we have this massive problem.
Yeah.
We're still running that 1624 operating system.
The one that treats rumors like survival manuals.
Yes. But we're doing it in a world of infinite information, and that glitch, it isn't just annoying anymore. I think it's becoming genuinely dangerous. That cognitive inconsistency, that snap from objective analysis to pure tribal loyalty is really the central conflict we want to investigate today.
Yeah.
Our mission for this deep dive is to get a handle on the psychological mechanisms that lead us to cling to these ancient tribal beliefs, our 1624 operating system, even when we have just overwhelming, verifiable 2024 era data right at our fingertips. We're going to try and dissect the psychological, the societal, and even the educational implications of this fundamental human cognitive glitch.
And what's so fascinating here, and I think this is the key, is realizing that the root cause isn't necessarily a failure of education. It's not about access to information.
Right. It's not about just being uninformed.
Not at all. It's a deep-seated vulnerability in how our brains are wired, specifically how we manage our identity and our membership in groups. To really understand why modern rationality just seems to fail when our tribal affiliation is threatened, we have to look at two really powerful psychological concepts.
Okay.
The first is belief perseverance, and the second is the one that really underpins all of this motivated reasoning, which is called identity protective cognition. We're essentially exploring the difference between, wanting to know the truth and needing to protect a comfortable group-sanctioned story.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start with that foundation, belief perseverance. I mean, if rationality is defined by being able to change your mind when you get better data, what does it mean that humans have this almost counter-rational drive?
Well, belief perseverance, and it's sometimes called conceptual conservatism, is precisely that. It's the maintenance of a belief despite new information that firmly contradicts it. Firmly. It speaks to a really profound structural challenge in how we make decisions. I mean, if we were purely rational agents, a belief would just instantly collapse when you encounter solid contradictory evidence. But we are just not built that way.
So it's not a bug, it's a feature.
You could almost say that. I mean, this tendency is so powerful that the philosopher F.C.S. Schiller argued that belief perseverance deserves to rank among the fundamental laws of nature.
Wow, a law of nature.
Yes, that elevates it from just some psychological quirk to something that's almost unavoidable, something built right into the very architecture of how we think.
So if the evidence is damning, why the stubbornness? What's the mechanism that actively drives us to ignore the logical collapse of a position and just maintain our internal view?
The primary engine driving this psychological stubbornness is a concept called cognitive dissonance theory. It was pioneered by a psychologist named Leon Festinger back in the 1950s. The premise is pretty simple. We are internally driven to achieve psychological consistency. When our actions conflict with our belief, or maybe two of our beliefs clash, that internal contradiction, it generates this really uncomfortable mental tension.
Right, that cringy feeling.
That's it. We call that tension dissonance. And our minds are powerfully motivated to reduce it. And here's the key. They often do it through really creative rationalization rather than by changing the core belief.
So the human mind's ultimate preference isn't for accuracy, it's for harmony.
Precisely. And the classic illustration of this mechanism is Festinger's own 1954 study. He and his colleagues studied a doomsday cult.
A doomsday cult. Okay, this should be good.
It's a famous one. The researchers spent time with a group who firmly believed the world was going to end on a very specific date, December 21st. And they really acted on this belief. I mean, they quit their jobs, they sold property, they severed ties with any friends who were non-believers.
And we went all in.
All in. Everything was predicated on this impending catastrophe.
So the moment of truth arrives. It's December 22nd. The world, very conspicuously, has not ended. The objective evidence is undeniable. Shouldn't the dissonance be so massive that it just forces an immediate rejection of the whole prophecy?
That's what pure logic would suggest. But the cost of admitting the error was just too high. Think about it. To admit they were wrong would be to acknowledge that all of these highly stressful, costly, and very public behaviors, quitting jobs, selling off their assets, were all based on a lie.
The psychological pain would be immense.
Agonizing. It would create just agonizing cognitive dissonance. So instead of abandoning the belief, they were motivated to invent a new rationalization, a new story to justify their actions and reduce that terrible tension.
And what was the story?
They declared that their intense devotion, their prayers, and their strong faith had actually saved the world from the catastrophe. They transformed this utter failure into a massive triumph.
So they changed the explanation for the failure to protect the identity of the believer.
You've got it. That's the mechanism. And this allows for the persistence of beliefs that are, as researchers Lee Ross and Craig Anderson put it, remarkably resilient in the face of empirical challenges that seem logically devastating.
Logically devastating. But how far does this run when we're looking at cold, hard, objective data, not spiritual faith? Let's talk about the findings from that calculator test.
The calculator test. This one revealed just how deep this conceptual conservatism runs, even when you're in the realm of mathematics.
Which should be totally objective.
Should be. Researchers engaged mathematically capable teenagers and adults, and they first asked them to just estimate solutions to simple arithmetic problems. Then they were given a calculator that was secretly rigged to provide figures that were increasingly wrong.
Rigged.
For instance, a simple multiplication like 252 times 1.2, which is 302.4, might return an answer on the calculator of 452.4, a number that is clearly significantly off the mark.
So the participants have their own logical estimate, and then a machine gives them a clearly absurd, contradictory number. A rational person would immediately question the tool, right? The calculator.
You would think so.
Yeah.
But what was the irrational belief they clung to?
What was it?
The belief that calculators are infallible, especially when compared to their own, presumably fallible manual estimation skills.
Wow.
About half the subjects went through 7 different rigged tasks, each one giving a more absurd answer than the last. And their primary defense mechanism wasn't to question the machine, it was to doubt their own competence.
No way!
Yes. They'd make comments about how bad their manual estimating abilities must be. They refused to let go of the assumption about the calculator's infallibility, showing this profound psychological preference for maintaining the status quo assumption over accepting repeated objective contradiction.
That's a fundamental betrayal of your own intellectual self-trust. But okay, if we move this up the expertise ladder to people whose whole professional identity is built on empirical validation, does the stubbornness finally break? I'm thinking about that science PhD test.
This test, involving 19 established science PhD researchers, we're talking professors and researchers at major universities, is truly unsettling because it shows how easily even highly trained scientific minds can succumb to this same conceptual conservatism.
So what was the setup?
They were given a formula for determining the volume of a sphere. Crucially, the formula was mathematically spurious. It was intentionally designed to make the sphere's volume appear 50% larger than its actual size.
So they were handed an incorrect theoretical framework, which they immediately adopted as a kind of temporary belief.
Exactly. And they were asked to test this framework in 2 ways. First, by using the fake formula, and second, by performing a direct, incontrovertible empirical measurement.
Which was?
Filling the sphere with water, pouring that water into a measured box, and observing the true physical volume. They physically witnessed the massive discrepancy between the formula's result and the observed reality. So they saw with their own eyes that the formula was wrong? What was the rationalization they used to cling to the original formula when they repeated the comparison with the second larger sphere? I mean, they're scientific experts. They must have recognized the error. Almost none of them corrected course. All but one of the 19 experienced scientists clung to the spurious formula.
That's astounding.
It is. When the researcher, Modi Nassani, reviewed the results, he found that the scientists used their advanced knowledge not to find the truth, but to construct these elaborate, sophisticated defenses for the concept they had just accepted.
So they weren't trying to disprove it, they were trying to prove it right.
Yes. They refused to discard the false concept, and instead they came up with ad hoc hypotheses to explain away the empirical water measurement. They suggested the sphere might have warped under the water's weight, or that the measuring box was defective, or that surface tension was somehow responsible for the water's apparent height difference.
They were using their complex knowledge of physics and fluid dynamics to argue that their own direct observation must be flawed, rather than concluding the basic formula they were given was flawed. That's an incredibly sophisticated defense of an established concept, no matter how recently it was established.
It is the ultimate defense of conceptual conservatism. They would rather deny their own senses and create these elaborate ad hoc hypotheses than abandon the concept they had assimilated just minutes before. And this tenacity, this intellectual defense mechanism, brings us directly to the more socially relevant and, frankly, dangerous phenomenon, identity protective cognition, or IPC.
Okay, so how does IPC differ from just general cognitive stubbornness or, plain old confirmation bias?
That's a great question. Confirmation bias is more about selectively seeking out information that confirms your own existing beliefs. IPC is different. It's the systematic tendency to defend your tribe's beliefs against any threatening evidence, and it happens regardless of your intelligence. It's deeply social.
So when we're talking about hot-button issues like climate policy or political ideologies,
they're not just defending an idea. We're defending our valued social group affiliations, be they political, cultural, or even professional.
So IPC then is like a mental immune system. It's defending the self from facts that threaten our group membership. Where does this come from? What are the evolutionary roots of this betrayal of objective rationality?
Cognitive scientists trace this bias to three interconnected factors. First, and this is the big one, evolutionary roots. For thousands and thousands of years, belonging to the tribe was non-negotiable for survival.
Right, being kicked out of the group meant death.
It was a death sentence. Being factually right, but socially ostracized, was a terrible trade-off. That deep-seated instinct to conform is still incredibly powerful and active in our brains today.
Okay, so that's one. What's the second?
Second is cognitive efficiency. I mean, think about it. Objectively and rigorously processing every single piece of contradictory information you encounter is exhausting. It's resource-intensive.
It's easier to just go with the flow.
Much easier. Relying on group consensus, what the trusted tribe believes, is an immediate mental shortcut that conserves our cognitive resources. And third, and this is perhaps the most potent factor, is social motivation.
Meaning?
Our self-esteem, our status, our sense of purpose. So much of it is derived from our valued groups. When evidence comes along that challenges the group's core narrative, the brain activates these profound psychological defenses to protect that core identity and our social standing.
And this is where the link between high intelligence and IPC becomes genuinely unsettling. It suggests that the smarter you are, the better you are at protecting the tribe.
That is the most profound and honestly difficult insight to accept. The research confirms it. The higher an individual's cognitive capacity, the sharper their 2024 software is, the better they are at constructing these elaborate, sophisticated rationalizations for the conclusion they were already motivated to accept.
So their intelligence is deployed not to find the objective truth,
but to build an unassailable fortress around their tribe-consistent position. As the researcher Dan Kahan observed, the smarter you are, the better you are at rationalizing those tribe-consistent positions. It transforms intelligence from a tool for discovery into a tool for defense.
That conclusion, that high intelligence can actually be a cognitive liability when your identity is challenged, that is perhaps the core danger of our information age. It moves the conflict beyond just ignorance and into actively deploying your skills to reject the truth. And nothing illustrates this spectacular failure of rationality better than Dan Kahan's landmark study on gun control.
This experiment was just brilliantly designed specifically to test that hypothesis. That identity, not just knowledge, is what drives scientific disagreement. The key was to use an identical empirical task, so the same set of numbers and percentages, but presented under two completely different contextual frames.
Okay, so the first one, the neutral condition, was about, what was it, a new skin cream treatment?
Correct. Participants were asked to interpret data as showing whether a skin rash improved or worsened after using a new cream compared to a placebo.
A totally neutral topic. No one's identity is wrapped up in skin cream.
Exactly. And in this neutral context, the findings were predictable. The higher numeracy participants performed brilliantly. 76% of the high numeracy folks correctly interpreted the complex statistical data compared to only 42% of the low numeracy participants.
So basic knowledge correlated positively with accuracy. It affirmed the traditional model of rationality. If you know more, you do better.
Absolutely. But then came the politically charged task. The identical data set, the very same numbers, was reframed around a highly contentious social issue, whether crime rates increased or decreased in cities that banned concealed weapons versus those that didn't. And the participants, whose political identities were known, were asked to interpret the data.
And the high numeracy participants, the ones who should have been best equipped to handle the statistics, actually performed worse when their tribal software kicked in.
Dramatically so. It's a shocking result. In the gun control scenario, among the low numeracy participants, 43% got the correct interpretation, about the same as in the skin tream test. But among the high numeracy group, the ones with the advanced mathematical skills, only 23% got it right.
23%, that's a huge drop.
It's a collapse. Their superior skills were deployed to actively misinterpret the data in a way that aligned with their existing political identity.
That is a stunning finding. It confirms the suspicion that they weren't seeking this statistical fact. They were utilizing their cognitive capacity to rationalize a predetermined conclusion. They were using their 2024 software to run their 1624 programming.
This directly contradicts what we call the science comprehension thesis, or SCT. That's the idea that political conflicts over science just stem from a simple knowledge deficit.
The idea that if people just knew more, they'd agree.
Right. If SCT were true, higher numeracy would always improve accuracy. Instead, the results strongly supported the identity protective cognition thesis, the IPC thesis, that cultural conflicts actively override the rational faculties people would normally employ. And you see this pattern holding true across all sorts of highly polarized domains globally, from climate science to energy policy.
This motivated reasoning then naturally leads to a behavioral pattern we call selective exposure. It's not just enough to rationalize the information you receive. You have to curate your entire information diet to preemptively avoid that cognitive dissonance in the first place.
Selective exposure is exactly that. It's the drive to seek information that reinforces your pre-existing views while you actively avoid contradictory information. People just crave that cognitive equilibrium. And in our modern, abundant information environment, this has created really profound consequences for polarization because media consumption is so easily tailored to our individual needs.
And the empirical evidence for this media polarization has been clear for decades.
Oh, absolutely. Individuals tailor their media choices to suit their emotional and cognitive needs, constantly seeking out that confirmatory information. If you look back at the 2004 Pew Research Center survey data, you see it clearly.
What did that show?
Republicans were about 1.5 times more likely to watch Fox News regularly than Democrats were, and they were 7 times more likely to report listening to Rush Limbaugh regularly. Conversely, Democrats were 1.5 times more likely to watch CNN.
So those deep preferences establish these really strong feedback loops.
And the consequence is what we're all experiencing today.
Yeah.
Partisan selective exposure leads directly to political polarization over time. It drives people into echo chambers, blogs, forums, highly specialized online groups where their original convictions are just constantly reinforced, which intensifies the partisan divide and solidifies their tribal identities.
Now, when we talk about trying to correct misinformation, there has long been this deep, almost paralyzing fear of something called the backfire effect. The idea that providing factual evidence to debunk a misconception, say about vaccine safety, could actually strengthen the original wrong belief. If this effect were widespread, any attempt at correction would be counterproductive. We'd be helpless against motivated ignorance.
And the backfire effect was conceptually categorized into a few types. There was the familiarity backfire, where just repeating the myth makes it more memorable. The overkill backfire, where you give too many arguments and it's overwhelming. And the big one, the worldview backfire, where the correction challenges someone's core identity. If that criticism really did strengthen the belief, it would mean we're better off saying nothing at all.
Okay, but here's where a crucial scientific update comes in. Does the backfire effect still hold up under rigorous scrutiny today?
The consensus has really shifted on this, and significantly so. Recent research, specifically a comprehensive review of the scientific literature from 2020, found widespread failures to replicate the backfire effect across various populations and topics.
Because it's not showing up consistently in experiments.
Exactly. Due to this lack of reproducibility, most researchers now believe that the backfire effect is either extremely rare, or it's confined to very specific and isolated circumstances, or it's just unlikely to occur on a broader population level.
That fundamentally changes the playbook for communicators, doesn't it? It means fact-checking and providing objective corrections are not actively dangerous.
Exactly. For most people, corrections and fact-checking are very unlikely to have a negative impact. In fact, studies have demonstrated positive effects in many circumstances. For instance, when informing believers in 9/11 conspiracy theories about expert statements. The main risk of a backfire remains only when the correction directly challenges an individual's core worldview or identity.
That IPC defense mechanism.
That's the one. If the facts can be delivered in a way that doesn't threaten the person's identity, they're far more likely to stick.
Okay, to ground this persistent tribal conflict in history, let's turn to vaccine hesitancy. This isn't a new phenomenon. It's a centuries-old battle of perseverance versus empirical evidence.
The history of opposition to vaccination is a perfect demonstration of this. It's persistent belief perseverance, where these deep-rooted philosophical, political, or spiritual beliefs remain the consistent drivers of opposition across different historical eras, despite the evolving scientific evidence. We could trace this persistent conflict all the way back to the introduction of the smallpox vaccine in the 19th century.
So what were the core objections to the smallpox vaccine in the 1800s before any mandatory laws were enacted?
The objections were really multifaceted. First, you had specific religious objections, partly because the vaccine came from cowpox lymph, which some clergy found distasteful or even unchristian.
From an animal. Right?
Exactly. Second, there was just a general distrust of the emerging medical profession. But third, and most powerfully, many people just fundamentally objected to the intervention itself. They viewed mandatory vaccination laws as a violation of their personal liberty.
So the government intervening with the body was seen as overreach.
It was seen as governmental overreach, and it triggered these strong tribal defenses rooted in individual autonomy.
And this objection was then crystallized by the mandatory vaccination acts that were passed by Parliament.
Yes. The Vaccination Act of 1853 made vaccination mandatory for infants, and then the 1867 Act extended this requirement to children up to 14 years old, and it imposed really steep penalties for refusal. This perceived tyranny just galvanized opposition groups like the Anti-Vaccination League. The backlash was massive and highly organized.
Tell us about the sheer scale of the opposition. I'm thinking of that Leicester demonstration march in 1885.
The Leicester March is still one of the most notorious anti-vaccination demonstrations in history. Somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 anti-vaccinators participated in this really elaborate procession.
That's a huge number for that time.
A staggering number. And the symbolism was key to conveying their outrage. They marched with banners, they carried a child's coffin to symbolize the perceived dangers of the vaccine, and they paraded an effigy of Edward Jenner, the vaccine's inventor, which they then ceremonially burned.
So a massive public display of identity and devotion to the anti-mandatory tribe.
And this sustained political pressure from this persistent public opposition eventually forced legal change. It led directly to the 1898 Vaccination Act, which acknowledged the power of personal conviction by removing the penalties for refusal and introducing the famous conscientious objector clause.
Ah, so that's where that comes from.
It formalized the idea that deeply held personal beliefs, even if they're scientifically inaccurate, had to be accommodated in public health policy.
And if you fast forward to later controversies, the specific scientific issues change. You have DTP, MMR, but the underlying psychological and political mechanisms, they just remain identical.
Precisely. In the mid-1970s, the DTP vaccine controversy erupted globally over alleged links to neurological conditions. Despite subsequent large-scale studies, like the National Childhood Encephalopathy Study, confirming the risk was extraordinarily low, advocacy groups and litigation just persisted. They were constantly seeking out and promoting any data that confirmed their fears. They formed these tight-knit groups that derived their identity from their opposition.
And then the most globally impactful instance in recent history was Andrew Wakefield's 1998 paper that linked the MMR vaccine to autism.
Wakefield's paper became the primary flashpoint. It was fueled by scientifically fraudulent data and a profound conflict of interest. And despite the subsequent retraction of the paper in 2010, the persistence of the belief is just staggering. Hundreds of international research studies have definitively found no causal link between the MMR vaccine and autism.
And yet, the belief persists.
It persists. The opposition simply shifts its focus. They move to concerns about toxins, like semirosal, even after that compound was largely removed from childhood vaccines and the scientific consensus rejected any causal role. The conclusion remains that the fundamental roots of the opposition are not about the scientific data itself.
It's about what?
It's about deep-seated philosophical, political, or spiritual beliefs. It's about distrust of government or corporate medicine, and it's about the issue of personal liberty. The tribal defense mechanism, that 1624 operating system, it remains firmly engaged right across the centuries.
We've established how our internal software, or cognitive biases, allows these persistent errors to survive. But this software operates on a massive global hardware platform that was built over centuries. So let's widen the lens a bit and look at how historic structures, specifically colonialism, created these self-replicating systems that structure the world we live in today.
This is where we get into the idea of colonial institutionalism. The fundamental idea is that formal colonial rule, even long after independence, set these really powerful historical trajectories through a phenomenon we call path dependency.
Path dependency. So once you're on a path, it's hard to get off it.
Very hard. The institutions, the economic policies, the social classifications that were created during colonialism, they persist because they are incredibly difficult or costly or politically hazardous to dismantle. Colonialism fundamentally established these unequal socioeconomic global relations. It locked former colonies into lower positions in the global division of labor and often stripped them of strong, autonomous local institutions.
So the economic disparities or governance challenges we see today aren't just bad luck. They are often the direct, predictable outcome of inherited structural artifacts that were intentionally built for colonial rule and have been reproduced over time.
Exactly. And we can categorize these enduring impacts into different modes of reverberation, starting with what we call the persistence of colonial instruments, or the reproduction of power.
What do you mean by instruments?
Colonizers developed and institutionalized specific tools, legal tools, economic tools, military tools for rule. And these tools became fixed structural elements that just survived the transition to independence.
Can you give us a detailed example of a legal residual of empire that is still in effect and causing harm today?
One of the starkest examples involves legal codes regarding homosexuality. The British Empire codified anti-homosexuality laws in its colonies using sections like 162 and 165 of the Penal Code. And these laws were imposed, they were not indigenous. In Kenya, for example, these sections, imposed by the British in 1897, remain intact today. The mechanism of persistence is simple. They were just never formally repealed after independence. And what's more, they're actively utilized. They're used by police forces as a pretext for harassment, for punishment, and for extortion of LGBT people.
Wow.
And critically, nearly 2/3 of the 69 countries globally that still prohibit homosexuality were at some point under British colonial rule. That demonstrates a direct path dependency from colonial lawmaking.
It's astonishing that a century-old law designed in London to control colonized populations is still dictating personal freedoms globally. But the impact is felt even in the former imperial centers themselves, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely, through what scholars sometimes call the boomerang effect. Consider the UK's current non-dom tax rules.
The non-dom status.
Right. These rules allow wealthy residents who claim non-domiciled status to pay UK tax only on income earned within the UK, while their foreign income remains largely untouched unless they bring it into the country. This system is a powerful magnet for global wealth.
But the origins of this rule are entirely colonial.
They trace all the way back to income tax laws that were passed in 1798 and 1799. These laws were specifically designed to encourage British settlers, who were often financing or managing colonial ventures, many of which relied on slave labor in the Caribbean, to keep their funds abroad.
So the government was incentivizing them.
They were. They incentivized these entrepreneurs by promising that profits derived from their colonial enterprises would not be taxed in the UK. This was done to facilitate investment into the imperial economy.
So a tax rule established over 200 years ago, designed to financially support a slave-based colonial economy, is still actively shaping wealth distribution and fiscal policy in modern London. What does this path dependency mean for the current economy?
It means that a significant portion of the capital flowing into the UK enjoys this privileged status, contributing to global wealth inequality and distortions in markets like UK real estate. The structure that was created to facilitate imperial finance is now functioning as a mechanism for international tax avoidance. It just highlights how incredibly hard it is to dismantle these deeply embedded economic structures once they've created a powerful constituency that benefits from them.
And we also see this path dependency in policing techniques through that boomerang effect you mentioned, where methods developed for colonial conquest are brought back to the metropole.
That's right. Consider modern predictive policing, or hotspot mapping, which uses geographical data to identify high crime areas.
Okay.
This tactic, which was originally called pin mapping, was popularized in the U.S. by a police chief named August Vollmer in the early 20th century. However, Vollmer had served in the U.S. Army during the Philippine-American War from 1899 to 1902. And pin mapping was invented and perfected by the U.S. Army during that conquest as a counterinsurgency tactic to track and hunt Filipino insurgents.
That's a powerful realization. The infrastructure and the tactical framework used to monitor and subdue a foreign population were simply imported and applied domestically. It suggests that modern U.S. policing inherited a lot of its operational logic from colonial counterinsurgency practices.
It certainly illuminates the persistence of power. And beyond these formal instruments, colonialism also generated these deep cultural schemas and ideational elements that function as an archive of meaning for current social actors.
So these are the narratives, the distinctions, the binaries that colonialism fostered.
Yes, we're talking about things like racialized distinctions, ideas about civilization, and that fundamental binary of the East versus the West.
Great.
These deep cultural schemas permeated academic knowledge and popular discourse alike. They were institutionalized through colonialism and have been repeatedly used and mobilized ever since to explain global conflict and difference. But here's the critical twist, what's called the nativist trap.
Which is how even anti-imperial movements can end up deploying the same Orientalist dichotomies.
Exactly. When you see fundamentalist or nationalist anti-Western movements constructing their political platform, they often deploy these essentialized binary categories, the traditional, pure, spiritual East versus the modern, corrupt, materialist West.
They use the same framework.
In using those categories to define their resistance, they are effectively reproducing the same discursive framework that classical imperialism relied upon to justify its rule in the first place. The intellectual weaponry of the resistance sometimes emerges from the very cultural legacy the empire created. It just shows the true endurance of the colonial archive in shaping global identity and conflict.
Okay, so we've established the scope of the problem. We have this fundamental cognitive glitch, the 1624 OS, that's easily weaponized by identity, and it's operating within these structural reverberations left by historical forces like colonialism. The critical question now becomes, how do we update the software? How do we teach people to reason better in the face of infinite information and motivated bias?
We need a radical new pedagogy because the traditional static frameworks for teaching critical thinking are demonstrably failing in the age of misinformation.
They're just not built for this environment.
Not at all. Critical media literacy today has to extend beyond mere analysis. It has to include recognizing our own cognitive biases, understanding how algorithmic curation affects what we see, and promoting the ethical creation of content. We have to address both the cognitive and the socio-emotional dimensions of learning.
All right, so let's start with an approach that directly addresses that cognitive software glitch. Cognitive inoculation techniques.
The mechanism here is based on psychological research on resistance to persuasion. It involves this preemptive exposure to weakened forms of misleading content. It essentially acts like a vaccine for the mind, helping the student build resistance to deceptive content they'll encounter later. The approach makes these tacit, manipulative techniques explicit.
And the best example of this in action is that online game, Bad News.
Yes. Researchers developed and tested this online game that exposes players to common misinformation tactics, but from the perspective of someone who is creating fake news.
So you learn by doing.
You learn by doing. You use tactics like emotional language, fear-mongering, and ad hominem attacks. And randomized trials with over 15,000 participants showed that this gamified inoculation significantly improved their ability to identify reliability cues in news content. And these positive effects persisted over time.
That's compelling evidence that these brief, active experiences can develop transferable critical evaluation skills across different cultural contexts. Okay, so what's the second approach?
That would be guided inquiry and problem-based learning. This approach is less about preventing manipulation and more about training students to think like professional evaluators. It moves away from the passive reception of media literacy concepts.
So teaching them a professional methodology, I understand this approach borrows heavily from the research on how professional fact-checkers evaluate sources.
Correct. Research comparing how high school students evaluate online information versus professional fact-checkers found this massive difference in strategy. Students tend to read vertically. They stay on one source and they just dig deeper into it.
Right.
Professionals use what's called lateral reading. They immediately open new tabs, they leave the initial page, and they verify the source's credibility by looking at what other people say about it. They establish the context and the source's reliability right away, bypassing any superficial design cues.
And this professional method, this lateral reading, can be taught.
Absolutely. The Stanford History Education Group, or SHEC, developed curricula based on these fact-checking practices, and their evaluation with high school students demonstrated significant improvements in the students' ability to evaluate online information after they participated in these guided inquiry activities focused on real-world examples. It works because it engages them with authentic content and provides strategic scaffolding to build those independent evaluation skills.
The third approach flips the script entirely: multimodal, production-centered pedagogies. So instead of teaching students how to consume critically, you teach them how to create ethically.
This approach positions students as capable creators rather than just passive recipients, which significantly increases their agency and their engagement. Studies have shown that the act of creating media, with explicit attention paid to credibility, evidence, and persuasive techniques, actually transfers to improved critical consumption practices.
It seems like the act of creation forces them to internalize the very evaluation criteria they should be applying to the media they consume. It bypasses the abstract nature of the concepts.
Precisely. The process of making these explicit decisions about credibility and evidence concepts that might remain abstract in a consumption-only approach, it becomes concrete. Studies have documented significant growth in participants' critical analysis of media representations and improvements in information evaluation skills after these media production programs.
Finally, we need an approach that addresses the specific structure of the modern information battlefield: social media.
That is the fourth evidence-based approach: scaffolded social media analysis frameworks. These are specifically designed to address the unique challenges of network information environments, things like virality, context collapse, and algorithmic curation elements that are often overlooked in traditional media literacy.
It's acknowledging that evaluating a tweet requires a completely different set of skills than analyzing a newspaper article.
Yes. Studies evaluated a curriculum that taught specific strategies for evaluating social media claims to high school students. They found that the students who learned these structured approaches to investigating viral content showed significant improvements in their ability to correctly evaluate misleading social media posts compared to students who only received general media literacy instruction. Strategy has to be platform-specific, and it has to address the speed and the emotional urgency of the medium.
So we have 4 strong evidence-based approaches. But implementing any new pedagogy comes with challenges. What are the key limitations facing this necessary update to our software?
There are 4 critical hurdles. First, the transfer of learning. Can the specific skills you learn about one technique or one platform generalize to novel misinformation formats you encounter later?
Right. Does learning about one trick protect you from a new one?
Exactly. Inoculation effects, for instance, might be technique-specific rather than conferring some broad, lasting resistance to all forms of misinformation. This is a constant research challenge.
Second would be sustainability. The information environment evolves so rapidly.
It does. Curricula focused on specific platforms risk rapid obsolescence. Digital platforms and manipulation techniques continue to outpace curriculum adaptations, creating this constant struggle for relevancy.
And finally, the effectiveness really rests heavily on the educators themselves. Teacher capacity.
The evidence shows that the effectiveness depends significantly on teacher preparation. Many teachers feel inadequately prepared to address these emerging media literacy challenges, particularly those involving the technical aspects of digital platforms or politically polarized content. For these pedagogies to succeed, initial teacher preparation has to incorporate explicit attention to critical media literacy, and it needs to be supported by sustained, reflective professional learning opportunities. Without confident, well-trained educators, these critical updates to our intellectual operating system will just fail to deploy. We started by examining that cognitive glitch that allows ancient tribal reasoning, that 1624 operating system, to override modern verifiable data. This deep dive really confirms that the persistence of tribal reasoning is not a sign of stupidity. It's a fundamental and often highly efficient feature of human cognition that evolved over millennia for survival. Our cognitive wiring prioritizes defending the tribe over achieving objective accuracy.
And the tragic irony is that the intelligence of the modern user, that high-capacity 2024 software capability, is exactly what makes the glitch so dangerous. When that intellect is deployed, it enables this highly sophisticated rationalization and skilled, motivated reasoning, just like we saw with the science PhDs and in the Kahan gun control data. Instead of using data to find the truth, people use their intelligence to form these elaborate arguments to protect their identity.
As Dan Kahan insightfully summarized it, the message is not that people are stupid. The message is that people are smart, maybe too smart for their own good. They are proficient, highly proficient, at defending the positions that maintain their standing within their most valued in-groups.
The empirical evidence from education and psychology, however, it does offer a path forward. We can't eliminate these cognitive biases entirely, but we can mitigate their effects through intentional, evidence-based practices, be it inoculation, structured inquiry, or production-centered pedagogies. This mitigation requires not just teaching external facts, but fundamentally reframing our identities, expanding our sense of tribe to include a broader humanity, and embracing identities centered on values like curiosity and humility rather than these narrow, defensive political or cultural affiliations.